This is a man by the name of Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel in 1860 in Germany. The book by Charles Darwin had just been translated into German. It was written, of course, in 1859, The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, and Haeckel read it in 1860 and thought, wow, this is phenomenal. This is a wonderful idea, and I want to find evidence to prove this. And so he went about doing just that. He went about searching for evidence that he thought proved evolution, and he came up with this idea that there was evidence that proved evolution. He said you can look at an embryo of an organism, and you can watch it trace its evolutionary history. And he came up with a term for this. He said, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And the students that would come into his class would sit and listen in awe as he would say, class, I would like to show you one of the most profound evidences that prove evolution. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And his students would say, wow. Did you know ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny? What in the world does that mean? Well, that's a good question. It means that the stages that an embryo goes through, its ontogeny, replays or repeats its evolutionary history, its phylogeny. Here's what it means in a nutshell. You can watch a human embryo, and it will start as a single-celled organism, and then it will change into something like a fish, and then it will change into something like a lizard, and then it will change into something like a mammal, and eventually come into the human state that it is going to have. And they said, Haeckel, what's the evidence for this? And he said, well, let me show you some pictures. And here they are. These are the pictures that Haeckel drew. Now, what I want you to understand is that these are not an isolated case used in some obscure textbook somewhere that we are pulling out of the air, out of the back shelf. This is standard evolutionary fare. It's right here on page, let's see, of this book. You can find it. Same pictures. Let me read to you the caption. The embryos of vastly different animals look quite similar during the earliest stages of development. These similarities in development hint at genes inherited from a common ancestor. He said, yeah, look at the top row of those embryos. They've all got gill slits. That's the fish stage. And then he said, if you look at how closely they resemble each other, he says, friends, that is evolution in action. He only had one problem. Those weren't really pictures of the embryos. Some of them he drew from memory, and some of them he would draw a single embryo and name it 3 different things. A chicken, a dog, a pig. Well, the people who actually studied embryos and saw what they looked like said, Haeckel, these aren't real embryos. These aren't really pictures of embryos. You know what he said? Yeah, that's true. They're not really. And in the 1870s, this information was disproven. And yet in 1999, it was used in the University of Western Florida's science textbook. I recently delivered a lecture similar to this in a school situation, and the teacher who had invited me had gone to the University of Western Florida and used that very textbook, in which Haeckel's embryos are pictured as proof of evolution. Let me read to you a statement by Stephen Jay Gould. He wrote this statement in a magazine called Natural History, a very prominent, prevalent, distributed magazine. He wrote an article titled Atrocious. And in this article, he is describing some things that happen in science that he believes are atrocious. And guess what one of those things is? Read this with me. Haeckel remains most famous today as the chief architect and propagandist for a famous argument that science disproved long ago, but that popular culture has never fully abandoned. Do you mean to tell me that Haeckel's embryos were disproved long ago? Oh yes. 120 years ago. And yet the University of Western Florida and hundreds of schools all over the country are using books that still use it to prove evolution. Do you know why you can't look at evolution critically? Well, because if you do, you will see that much of the information that supposedly proves it has been disproven for 100 years or so. Read with me what else Stephen Jay Gould says. He says, "We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks. But we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not the majority of modern textbooks." He said, it's one thing for those to get in there originally, but we should be astonished and ashamed that they've been in there for 100 years and we've known they don't bear any semblance to a shred of evidence that would suggest that evolution is the case. Do you know who Stephen Jay Gould is? He is not a creationist. He was, during his life, one of the most outspoken atheistic evolutionists that lived during his time. And he says we should be ashamed. That's right. Folks, they should be ashamed, because that is unconscionable. To be teaching something that has been false and they've known it for 100 years. Let me ask you this question. Why do you think this is? Why do you think that books like the one that we have shown you are filled with things like the English peppered moth, filled with things like Haeckel's embryos? It's only a 100-page book. Do you know why it's filled with information like this? Because if it weren't, it'd be a 3-page book. And those 3 pages would have things like this probably, possibly, might have, there's a chance that. That's why. Continue with me. These are books that have used Haeckel's embryos to teach evolution. South Huntington School District Honors Biology in Huntington Station, New York. The 1999, maybe this is hitting a little closer to home, Texas Board of Education adopted this book for the entire state. And it uses Haeckel's embryos as evidence for evolution. Biology, the Unity and Diversity of Life, used at the University of Tennessee in Martin, used in Biology 101 at Central Michigan University, all use this information as proof for evolution. And folks, I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of textbooks that use this. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould said in probably the majority of textbooks.